Hello, and welcome to today's special. I myself love iceberg breakdowns and have always wanted to dive into one. I thought where better and more ironic to start than the Titanic. Humor aside, the sinking of the Titanic and the discoveries that followed are deep and interesting, as well as being mysterious depending on what you believe. I will be covering multiple levels of obscurity and tragedy. This is my first iceberg breakdown. Please let me know if I should do more and about what. These take a lot more planning than my other forms of content. Surface level. Jack and Rose. When people think of the Titanic, the first image that comes to mind isn't a real historical event. It's Jack and Rose. These two fictional characters, played by Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet in James Cameron's 1997 film Titanic, have become the unofficial mascots of the tragedy. Jack Dawson, a poor artist who wins his ticket aboard the Titanic in a poker game, and Rose DeWitt Bukater, a wealthy young woman trapped in a suffocating engagement, represent the classic love across classes trope. Their romance plays out on the decks of the doomed ship, and Jack's eventual sacrifice, freezing in the icy Atlantic while Rose floats on a piece of debris, has become an iconic piece of pop culture. This dramatized relationship never existed in real life, but its impact on how the Titanic is remembered is massive. Some people even visit Jack Dawson's grave in Nova Scotia, not realizing it's for a real man with the same name who wasn't the romantic figure from the film. This blending of fiction and reality speaks volumes about how movies can shape collective memory, sometimes more strongly than the actual history. Not enough lifeboats. One of the most infamous facts about the Titanic is that there were not enough lifeboats on board for all the passengers and crew. The ship was carrying just 20 lifeboats, enough for roughly 1,178 people, despite having over 2,200 souls aboard. And this wasn't an oversight. The ship actually exceeded the minimum lifeboat requirements of the time, which were based on tonnage, not passenger count. Titanic's designers had originally intended to install more lifeboats, but aesthetics and open deck space for first-class passengers took priority. As a result, several lifeboat stations were left unused. When the ship began sinking, confusion and panic led to many lifeboats being launched only partially filled. Lifeboat number 1, for instance, left with only 12 people despite a capacity of 40. As the reality set in, chaos followed, and many passengers, especially those in third class, never even had a chance. The lack of lifeboats has become symbolic of the arrogance and complacency that surrounded the ship's creation. It's not just a logistical failure, it's a metaphor for how safety was sacrificed for luxury and how regulations lagged behind the scale of ambition. The unsinkable ship. The Titanic was known as the unsinkable ship, a term that would become tragically ironic after it went down on its maiden voyage. But the truth is a bit more nuanced. The White Star Line never officially claimed the ship was unsinkable in absolute terms. Rather, promotional materials said it was practically unsinkable, a phrase that the public and press quickly twisted into certainty. The belief came from the ship's design, which included a series of watertight compartments that could be sealed off in case of a breach. In theory, the ship could stay afloat with up to 4 compartments flooded. The problem was that the iceberg ripped open 5 or more compartments. As each filled with water, the ship's bow became too heavy and tilted downward, allowing water to spill over into each adjacent compartment like a series of sinking bathtubs. So while the ship was advanced for its time, it was never invincible. The myth of it being unsinkable fed into a greater narrative of hubris, a belief that human engineering could overcome nature itself. When the Titanic sank, it shattered that illusion, marking the end of what many called the Gilded Age of overconfidence. Iceberg dead ahead. The phrase iceberg dead ahead is one of the most famous lines associated with the Titanic disaster. It's dramatized in nearly every film or retelling of the event, and it captures the final moment of possible salvation, just seconds too late. On the night of April 14, 1912, at approximately 11:40 p.m., Frederick Fleet, one of the lookouts in the Crow's Nest, spotted the iceberg directly in the path of the ship. He rang the bell 3 times and phoned the bridge to deliver the warning. But despite his quick reaction, it wasn't enough. The ship was traveling at around 22 knots, nearly top speed, and had very little room to maneuver. The officer on duty attempted a hard-a-starboard turn, and the engines were ordered to full reverse. The Titanic managed to veer slightly, but not enough to avoid scraping the iceberg along its starboard side. The impact caused a jagged rupture across multiple compartments below the waterline. It wasn't a head-on collision, it was a glancing blow, but it was fatal nonetheless. The phrase, "iceberg dead ahead," lives on as the chilling announcement of irreversible doom, echoing through history as the last call before the fall. Celine Dion's voice. In the 1997 Titanic film, James Horner's musical score played a critical emotional role, but it was Celine Dion's voice that cemented the film in cultural immortality. Her song, "My Heart Will Go On," became the unofficial anthem of the Titanic tragedy, blending sweeping orchestral music with haunting lyrics that framed the fictional love story as an eternal memory. The song was a massive commercial success, topping charts around the world and earning an Academy Award for Best Original Song. But more than that, it became a kind of emotional shorthand. Just a few piano notes from the intro are enough to evoke the film, the sinking, and the sense of loss it dramatized. For an entire generation, the Titanic wasn't a real shipwreck from 1912. It was a cinematic tragedy scored by Celine Dion. That crossover between history and pop culture is powerful. The real victims of the disaster often fade into the background as the song becomes the stand-in for grief. It's beautiful, yes, but also strange that such a commercialized element would dominate the remembrance of one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in history. The Heart of the Ocean. The Heart of the Ocean is one of the most memorable symbols from the Titanic movie, yet it's entirely fictional. In the film, it's a massive blue diamond necklace supposedly worn by Louis XVI and passed down through the hands of royalty before ending up around Rose's neck. The necklace serves as a symbol of wealth, love, and loss, and ultimately becomes the final emotional gesture when elderly Rose drops it into the Atlantic at the film's end. While no such diamond was ever aboard the real Titanic, the idea of lost treasure has always hovered around the ship's wreck. Countless rumors and myths speak of wealthy passengers bringing priceless jewels, rare books, or even cursed artifacts on board. The Heart of the Ocean plays into this collective fantasy, adding a mythical touch to a very real tragedy. Interestingly, a few jewelers actually created replicas after the film's release, some worth millions, and they've been auctioned for charity or displayed in museums. The necklace may be fake, but its emotional resonance is very real. It taps into our love for mystery, romance, and the idea that something precious went down with the ship and stayed there untouched in the dark. Below the surface. The Californian's silence. The Californian was a ship within sight of the Titanic as it sank, possibly the only vessel close enough to offer timely help. At around 10:30 p.m., the Californian had stopped for the night due to ice warnings. Its sole wireless operator, Cyril Evans, had been rebuffed by Titanic's Marconi operator earlier that evening when he tried to send a warning about nearby icebergs. Shut up, I'm busy," the Titanic's operator snapped. He was handling paid passenger messages at the time. Not long after, the Californian's wireless went silent for the night. Around 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck the iceberg. As rockets were fired into the air, the Californian's crew saw them, but misinterpreted them as celebratory fireworks, not distress signals. The captain, Stanley Lord, was informed but chose not to take action. Later investigations would severely criticize his inaction, though he would defend himself until his death. The haunting part is this: while Titanic passengers froze and drowned, a fully operational ship sat just a few miles away in the dark, unmoving. The silence of the Californian has come to symbolize negligence at the edge of salvation, how close rescue was and how human error turned hope into nothing. J. Bruce Ismay's escape. J. Bruce Ismay was the managing director of the White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic. As a powerful figure behind the ship's creation, he was on board for its maiden voyage, and was initially seen as a promoter of its safety and luxury. But when the Titanic began to sink, Ismay's actions would become the focus of scorn and controversy. He boarded one of the last lifeboats to leave the starboard side, Lifeboat C, and survived the disaster. Unlike Captain Smith, who went down with the ship, Ismay returned to England only to be vilified by the press. They painted him as a coward who abandoned women and children, using his status to save himself. While the British and American inquiries found no legal wrongdoing, his reputation was destroyed. He lived in isolation for much of his remaining life. What makes this haunting isn't just that he escaped, it's that he was seen as the embodiment of arrogance, cowardice, and corporate failure. The man who helped build the Titanic watched it go down and lived, while over 1,500 others didn't. Whether fair or not, Ismay's name became synonymous with betrayal, and that stain has never truly faded. The band played on. One of the most iconic and tragic images of the Titanic disaster is that of the ship's band continuing to play music as the vessel slowly descended into the freezing Atlantic. The group, led by Wallace Hartley, was made up of 8 musicians hired by an agency, not directly by the ship. When chaos erupted and passengers scrambled for lifeboats, these men stayed behind, performing in an effort to calm those around them. Survivors recalled hearing hymns and light classical music echoing above the panic. No one knows exactly what their final song was. Some reported hearing "Nearer, My God, to Thee," a hymn associated with death and comfort, but this is debated. What's certain is that none of the band members survived. Their bodies were later found in the frigid waters, some still strapped to their instruments. The idea that they played on while facing certain death is often romanticized, but it's also incredibly grim. These were not privileged passengers with private cabins or access to lifeboats. They were working men, trapped with the rest. Their final act, whether one of duty, defiance, or helplessness, stands as a haunting example of calm in the face of the abyss. Coal fire in Boiler Room 6. Before the Titanic ever struck the iceberg, there was already a fire smoldering deep inside her hull. A coal bunker fire had been burning for days in Boiler Room 6, long enough that engineers and stokers were assigned to manage it even as the ship set sail. Coal fires in steamships weren't unheard of at the time, but this one was reportedly intense. Some firemen later claimed it had weakened the bulkhead where the iceberg would later strike. The most unsettling part? There's some evidence that the company knew about the fire and sailed anyway, worried that canceling the maiden voyage would damage White Star Line's reputation and finances. Photographs taken before departure show a dark scorch mark on the hull, right where the iceberg impact occurred. While there's no official ruling that the coal fire directly caused the disaster, the idea that Titanic was already compromised before it ever hit ice raises chilling possibilities. It suggests a kind of doomed inevitability, that the ship wasn't just unlucky but already wounded, and that those in charge decided to risk it anyway. The first-class lock-in theory. During the chaos of the Titanic's final hours, a disturbing theory emerged and continues to be discussed, that crew members were ordered to prevent steerage, or third-class passengers, from accessing the lifeboats, prioritizing first-class survival. While not officially confirmed, survivor testimonies lend weight to this. Several third-class passengers reported being physically blocked from reaching the upper decks. Some found gates locked. Others claimed crew told them to stay put. The official story is that this was to maintain order and control crowd flow. But when you compare survival rates, the pattern is damning. Over 60% of first-class passengers survived, while less than 25% of third class did. Women and children in third class had significantly worse odds than their counterparts in first class. The notion of lock-in paints a grim picture of classism in action, one that didn't just affect comfort or accommodations, but who lived and who died. The Titanic was a floating microcosm of Edwardian society, and when disaster struck, that rigid social order may have directly cost hundreds of lives. Whether it was a series of panicked decisions or systemic disregard, the implication is the same. Some people never had a chance. Third class and locked gates. Third class passengers, mostly immigrants, laborers, and families seeking better lives in America, were packed into the lower decks of the Titanic. While technically given access to the rest of the ship, their movement was restricted by a system of locked gates and barriers. These were standard maritime procedures at the time, meant to enforce class separation and comply with immigration laws. The idea was to prevent disease and keep social groups segregated. But when the Titanic began to sink, those same barriers became death traps. Testimonies from survivors describe confusion, narrow corridors, and literal gates that kept them below while lifeboats were being lowered above. Some crew members eventually opened these gates, but by then, precious time had been lost. The image of entire families stuck below deck, not because of bad luck, but because they were sealed off by class and policy, remains one of the most haunting aspects of the sinking. It reframes the disaster not as a chaotic accident, but as a deeply structured tragedy, one where your position in society dictated your chances of survival almost completely. In that sense, the Titanic didn't just sink, it enforced a kind of judgment. Down the iceberg. The Olympic switch theory. One of the most infamous Titanic conspiracy theories suggests that the ship that actually sank wasn't the Titanic at all, but its nearly identical sister ship, the Olympic. According to proponents of the Olympic switch theory, the White Star Line deliberately swapped the ships in a high-level insurance scam. The Olympic had sustained significant damage in a previous accident and was considered a financial liability. The theory claims the company disguised the older ship as the Titanic and planned a controlled accident to collect the insurance money. What makes this more than just fantasy is how closely the two ships resembled each other. They were virtually twins in design, and some photographs and accounts show minor structural differences that seem to disappear once the Titanic is launched. Conspiracy theorists point to anomalies in porthole placement, lifeboat numbers, and surviving crew testimonies that suggest something was off. Of course, no official investigation ever supported this idea, but the theory persists because of one haunting possibility. If true, then thousands of people died, not because of an accident, but because they were unknowingly sacrificed in a calculated act of corporate fraud. Whether plausible or not, the sheer darkness of the theory ensures it never fully dies. Violet Jessup's trifecta. Violet Jessup, often called Miss Unsinkable, was a stewardess and nurse who survived not one, not two, but 3 ship disasters involving the White Star Line. She was aboard the Olympic when it collided with a British warship in 1911. She was then transferred to the Titanic, where she survived by boarding Lifeboat 16. A few years later, she was serving as a nurse on the Britannic, the third of the Olympic-class ships, when it struck a mine and sank in the Aegean Sea. Jessup survived again, though this time she sustained a skull fracture from jumping into a lifeboat that was sucked into the ship's propellers. What makes Jessup's story eerie isn't just the statistical improbability, it's the idea that she was present at every major White Star Line catastrophe involving this class of ship. Some have dubbed her a harbinger or a cursed figure. Others say she was simply lucky, but there's something morbidly poetic about one woman brushing so closely with death 3 times in such similar circumstances. She lived to tell the tale, but what she witnessed, drowning, panic, carnage, followed her for the rest of her life. In her memoirs, she described surreal calm amid chaos. Maybe by the 3rd time, death just passed her by. The watertight bulkhead trap. Titanic's designers took pride in its watertight bulkhead system, series of sealed compartments meant to contain flooding if the hull was breached. On paper, it was a technological marvel, but in practice, it became a silent killer. The compartments didn't extend all the way to the top of the ship, so as the front compartments filled, the water spilled over like a cascading waterfall into the next, and the next, until the ship's fate was sealed. There's a cruel irony here. The very system meant to keep the ship safe actually accelerated its demise. And it's even more haunting to consider how passengers and crew would have felt inside those bulkheads. Sealed off, cut off, doomed, some trapped behind closed doors, some fully aware there was no exit. The trap metaphor runs deep. Titanic was marketed as a triumph of engineering, a fortress at sea. But those very mechanisms became death chambers. Watertight doors were closed to save the ship, but in doing so, they also guaranteed no one behind them could escape. It wasn't just about drowning, it was entombment, a mechanical, orderly death in a ship that was supposed to be unsinkable. The Rich Men's Club cancellations. In the days leading up to Titanic's voyage, several of the wealthiest and most powerful men who originally planned to be aboard mysteriously canceled their trips. Among them was J.P. Morgan, the American financier who essentially owned the White Star Line. He had even planned to display his Egyptian antiquities on the ship, but backed out at the last moment, citing illness, yet was later seen in good health in France. Industrialist Milton Hershey of the Hershey Chocolate Empire also canceled his booking. Others include George Washington Vanderbilt and banking titan Henry Clay Frick. Some canceled due to business conflicts, others due to illness. But the cluster of dropouts, especially among such high-profile individuals, has raised eyebrows for over a century. The theory? They knew something, or at least sensed something. Some believe Morgan canceled because he knew the Titanic's fate wasn't an accident. Others believe he backed out of what was intended to be a disaster for financial manipulation or to eliminate rivals. It's pure speculation, but the chilling truth is that most of the richest men who survived weren't on the ship at all, and the ones who were, like John Jacob Astor IV, didn't make it. The closed binocular locker. The Titanic's crow's nest watchmen, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were tasked with scanning for icebergs on the night of the collision, but they were missing one critical tool: binoculars. The key to the locker that held the ship's field glasses had accidentally been taken ashore by David Blair, an officer removed from the voyage at the last minute. This oversight meant the lookouts were relying on naked eyes, straining to spot objects in the dark, moonless Atlantic. By the time the iceberg was visible, it was far too late to avoid impact. Fleet later testified at the British inquiry that binoculars could have helped them see the iceberg sooner. The detail sounds trivial, just a missing key. But when you consider that a $10 lock may have made the difference between detection and disaster, it becomes maddening. It wasn't sabotage, it wasn't malevolence, it was forgetfulness. Human error at its most mundane and most catastrophic. The Titanic didn't just fall to the sea. It fell to a cascade of missed chances, overlooked tools, and decisions made in comfort that would be paid for in screams. Father Byles' final sermon. Father Thomas Byles was a Catholic priest traveling aboard the Titanic to officiate his brother's wedding in New York. When the ship began to sink, he was offered a place on a lifeboat, twice. He refused both times. Instead, he remained on deck, reciting prayers, offering absolution, and comforting passengers in their final moments. Survivors remembered him leading a group in the rosary as the deck tilted beneath their feet. His final sermon, if you can call it that, was one of grace under pressure. He reportedly moved among passengers of all classes, praying in multiple languages and offering what calm he could. When the stern rose and the ship's final plunge began, he was still with the people, kneeling, praying, and refusing salvation for himself. It's a haunting portrait of selflessness. While others scrambled for lifeboats or turned away, Father Byles accepted death and faced it with spiritual clarity. His presence in those final minutes stands in contrast to the chaos and terror around him. He didn't just die on the Titanic, he served on it to the very last breath. In a story filled with classism, cowardice, and confusion, his actions remain one of the purest acts of courage. Mystery Man of the Crow's Nest. Among the stranger anomalies in the Titanic's story is the unidentified man said to have been seen in the crow's nest shortly before the iceberg was spotted. Some survivors claimed they noticed an unfamiliar figure up there, not part of the regular watch rotation. He wasn't listed in the official crew logs, and no one could account for his presence. Was it a stowaway, a crewman pulled in from another duty, or simply a case of misremembered trauma? The story has floated in Titanic lore for years, with no definitive answer. Theories range from harmless misidentification to more sinister ideas, that someone was up there as part of a cover-up, or perhaps even observing, not warning. There's no hard proof, but in a disaster filled with overlooked signals and unheeded warnings, the idea of a phantom figure in the lookout, seeing what others didn't, saying nothing, adds a spectral layer to the narrative, like a ghost haunting a moment of history before the tragedy fully unfolded. If there was someone else up there, the question isn't just who it was, but what they were doing, and why they said nothing. The bottom of the iceberg. W.T. Stead's warnings. William Thomas Stead was no ordinary Titanic passenger. A well-known British investigative journalist and spiritualist, he was famous for both his bold writing and his obsession with death and the supernatural. Before boarding the Titanic, Stead had written not one, but two stories eerily similar to the disaster. One was about a ship that sank after colliding with an iceberg and lacked enough lifeboats. The other described a luxury liner hit by a collision that killed thousands due to negligence. Then, in 1912, he boarded the Titanic, telling friends beforehand that he had dreamed of his own death by drowning. He even allegedly claimed that he would die when a great disaster takes many. During the sinking, Stead was seen giving his life jacket to a woman and calmly sitting in the first-class smoking room, waiting for the end. Some believe Stead's fate wasn't just tragic, it was fated. He was part of secretive spiritualist circles, had connections to political elites, and often accused those in power of dangerous hubris. Was he simply doomed by coincidence, or did he know too much? His writings, his dreams, and his death intersect in a way that feels less like fiction and more like a warning ignored. The Mummy Curse Manifest. One of the most persistent and bizarre myths about the Titanic is that it carried a cursed Egyptian artifact in its cargo hold, the so-called unlucky mummy. The artifact, a painted coffin lid thought to house a priestess of Amun-Ra, had been associated with multiple deaths and misfortunes among those who possessed or transported it in England. The British Museum eventually removed it from public display due to the rumors. According to the legend, the artifact was being shipped to America aboard the Titanic under the care of a wealthy collector. Some accounts say it was stored in cargo hold number 12, and that strange events began even before the ship left port. Equipment failures, nervous crew, and ominous dreams among passengers. Historically, there's no confirmed evidence the mummy was on the Titanic. Its artifact remains in the British Museum today. But the myth took root quickly, partly because of how easily it fit into the horror, a cursed relic, an unsinkable ship doomed. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was cosmic punishment. Whether truth or fabrication, the tale of the mummy offers a glimpse into how people reach for the supernatural when the real explanations are too senseless to accept. The Samson and the Illegal Hunt. In 1962, a man named Hendrik Bergathon came forward with a disturbing confession. His father, a crewman on a Norwegian sealing ship called the Samson, had witnessed the Titanic sinking, but fled the scene. According to the account, the Samson was illegally hunting seals in protected waters that night. When the crew saw Titanic's distress rockets, they chose not to approach, fearing arrest or fines. Instead, they turned off their lights and sailed away silently. This account matches several survivor testimonies claiming to have seen another ship nearby, closer than the Carpathia or even the Californian. If true, it means there was yet another chance at rescue, one even closer and more morally damning. The Samson could have saved lives, perhaps hundreds, but fear of being caught breaking the law triumphed over humanity. There's still no definitive proof the Samson was there. But if Bergathon's claim is true, it reframes the disaster entirely. The Titanic didn't just sink in isolation. It sank, while a silent witness sailed away, unwilling to help. It's a horror of apathy and legality, of how human lives were weighed against fines and lost. Cargo hold number 3 and the 30 tons. Official records list all the cargo aboard the Titanic: mailbags, champagne, luxury cars, and fine china. But there are rumors of something else stored deep in hold number 330 tons of mystery materials labeled under vague or generic descriptions. Among these were large lead containers with no specific declaration, allegedly ordered by unknown entities and loaded last minute in Southampton. Some researchers believe this cargo was radioactive or otherwise hazardous, possibly radium for experimental medical or military use, or mercury. Others claim it was simply improperly recorded industrial material. Whatever the case, this section of the ship was one of the first to flood and remains dangerously unstable even in the wreck. ROVs sent into hold number 3 have experienced unusual failures: cameras freezing, motors stalling, systems shorting out. Salvage operators rarely speak publicly about this hold, and some claim to have been told not to pursue it further. What was in those 30 tons, if anything? Was it innocent cargo, or something deliberately hidden beneath layers of corporate red tape? The Titanic may have sunk as a symbol of hubris, but inside her belly may have been cargo never meant to be found. The silence around it is louder than any confession. Below the iceberg. Morgan's Pyramid. J.P. Morgan wasn't just the financier behind the White Star Line. He was a titan of American capitalism, a man with fingers in nearly every industrial empire of the Gilded Age. But he was also a deeply secretive figure, surrounded by rumors of occult involvement and esoteric influence. When Morgan suddenly canceled his trip on the Titanic at the last minute, it raised eyebrows. He claimed illness, yet was later seen perfectly healthy in France enjoying a Turkish bath. That decision alone is chilling, especially considering the number of powerful industrial rivals of Morgan who did go down with the ship. John Jacob Astor IV, Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's, and Benjamin Guggenheim all perished in the sinking. All were prominent opponents of the creation of the U.S. Federal Reserve, which would eventually become a cornerstone of centralized economic control, an institution Morgan championed. But it goes deeper. Some fringe researchers allege Morgan was part of a Masonic or occult inner circle, tied to ancient financial rites and symbols. The Titanic's launch date, the coordinates of the iceberg collision, even the architecture of the ship itself have been examined under this lens. They claim the Titanic wasn't just a ship, it was a vessel of ritual. The theory says the deaths weren't tragic, but necessary. A pyramid, symbol of power, secrecy, and sacrifice, was said to be etched onto Morgan's personal stationery and used as an emblem in his banking empire. While there's no verified evidence that Morgan orchestrated a mass murder, the synchronicities, his absence, the rivals' loss, the political aftermath leave a stain of suspicion. The Titanic helped pave the way for the Federal Reserve just 1 year later. Was it just a string of coincidences? Maybe. Or maybe the Titanic was more than just the end of an era. It was the beginning of a new world order born from salt water and screams. The disappearing lifeboat. 1 crew. Lifeboat 1 is one of the lesser-known enigmas of the Titanic, but its story is laced with shadows. It was the first lifeboat to be lowered from the starboard side, and unlike most, it left the ship with only 12 people aboard, despite being built to carry 40. Even more unsettling, several of its occupants were men of high rank or wealth, including Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife, Lady Lucy. Alongside them were a small handful of crewmen, including a few firemen and sailors. But it wasn't just the elite passengers that drew suspicion. It was what happened afterward. Reports surfaced that money had changed hands. Lady Duff Gordon was accused, never officially but persistently, of bribing the crew not to return for drowning passengers. She later admitted to giving each crewman £5 after they reached safety. She called it a gesture of thanks. Survivors and investigators called it blood money. But the story takes an even darker turn when you follow the crew. Of the men aboard Lifeboat 1, several would vanish from public record. Some refused to testify. Others disappeared entirely, never seen again. Those who did speak gave contradicting accounts, claiming they feared capsizing or that no cries were heard. Testimony was vague and much of it sealed or redacted. Some later suggested the crew had been silenced, either through payoffs or pressure. Even stranger, Lifeboat 1 was the only boat without any women or children passengers. Despite the chaos, despite the protocol, it floated away mostly empty, with powerful names aboard, and made no effort to help others. Why? No one ever fully answered that. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was selfishness, or maybe Lifeboat 1 wasn't meant to return. Maybe those aboard carried knowledge or guilt that made them valuable to protect and dangerous to question. The real horror isn't just the people who died, it's the ones who survived and then vanished into silence. Thank you for joining me on this breakdown of the Titanic iceberg and staying with me until the end. There was definitely room on this door for the both of us.